It didn't begin with a public announcement, but with a silence that spread through palace corridors like a warning. A closed-door meeting. A reshuffled schedule. And then, one name quietly removed and replaced. By the time aides began denying anything unusual, the decision had already been made. Prince Edward had stepped into a role no one expected him to claim, one previously held by a figure the palace had long struggled to contain. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The shift was so subtle at first that even seasoned royal watchers hesitated to call it what it was. A private meeting, attended only by the most senior members of the household, had been scheduled with unusual urgency. No press notice, no official briefing, and yet, within hours, something had changed. Staff who had once operated with routine confidence were suddenly guarded, measured in their words, cautious in their movements. Reports suggest that aides were quietly instructed to avoid certain topics altogether, as if even acknowledging the situation might give it weight. And then came the first visible sign: the unexplained absence. A figure once central to key royal duties simply stopped appearing. No announcement, no clarification, just a void where presence had once been expected. In that void, Prince Edward began to emerge. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with a quiet assumption of responsibility that felt both deliberate and calculated. Engagements once handled by another were now appearing under his name. Meetings were attended, documents reviewed, decisions made, all without acknowledgement of the shift taking place. Insiders whisper that this was no coincidence. For weeks, perhaps even months, something had been building beneath the surface. Subtle tensions, quiet disagreements, a growing sense that the balance within the institution was becoming increasingly fragile. Early media murmurs had hinted at unrest, but they were quickly dismissed, brushed aside as speculation. Yet those closest to the inner workings of the palace began to notice patterns that were difficult to ignore. A change in tone, a tightening of control, and above all, a silence that felt intentional rather than accidental. It was as if the institution itself was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, it came without warning. Edward's presence was not just symbolic, it was operational. He was stepping into responsibilities that required trust, precision, and above all, stability. The kind of stability that only comes from years of quiet service, far from the glare of controversy. But what made this transition so striking was not just the speed with which it unfolded, but the secrecy that surrounded it. Even seasoned insiders found themselves piecing together fragments, trying to understand what had triggered such a decisive move. Because in a system built on tradition and continuity, sudden changes are rarely accidental. They are responses, corrections, signals that something deeper has shifted. And as the days passed, the pattern became clearer, though never officially confirmed. A role had been taken, a presence had been removed, and in its place, a new figure had quietly assumed control. But this wasn't a simple reshuffle, it was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated correction, years in the making. For years, the role existed in a strange gray zone, highly visible, yet deeply controversial. It carried influence, access, and proximity to the monarchy's inner workings. But it also came with whispers of tension, missteps, and quiet dissatisfaction. And now, without ceremony, it had been taken away. To understand why this quiet removal sent such a powerful ripple through the institution, you have to understand what the role truly represented. It wasn't just a title or a set of duties, it was a position woven into the very fabric of royal influence, a gateway to decision-making circles that shaped not just public appearances, but internal direction. Those who held it stood close to the pulse of the monarchy, privy to conversations that never reached the outside world, trusted with responsibilities that required not just competence, but restraint. And yet, over time, that trust had begun to strain. Reports suggest that the figure who once occupied the role had gradually become a source of unease within certain royal circles. Not in a way that could be publicly addressed, not in a way that could be easily defined, but in a pattern of moments that, when viewed together, painted a troubling picture. Insiders whisper that there were disagreements behind closed doors, subtle but persistent, the kind that never erupt into open conflict but instead linger, unresolved, shaping decisions in quiet ways. There were signals, too small, almost imperceptible shifts that only those paying close attention would notice. A missed engagement here. A reassigned responsibility there. The kind of adjustments that, on their own, meant little, but together suggested something deeper was unfolding. Over time, those signals grew harder to ignore. Media insiders began to pick up on inconsistencies, though without confirmation, their reports remained cautious, speculative. Still, the questions persisted. Why was this role, once so central, beginning to feel unstable? Why did its presence seem to create as much tension as it did? Authority? The answer, it seems, lay in the delicate balance the monarchy must maintain, a balance between visibility and discipline, between influence and control. This particular role sat right at that intersection, making it both powerful and vulnerable. And when that balance is disrupted, even slightly, the consequences can ripple outward in unpredictable ways. Those familiar with the inner workings of the institution suggest that concerns had been building for some time, quietly discussed, carefully evaluated. There was no single moment of failure, no dramatic incident that forced an immediate response. Instead, it was a gradual realization, a growing consensus that something needed to change. Pressure, subtle but persistent, began to mount. Not publicly, not in a way that could be easily traced, but within the corridors where decisions are made with caution and precision. The role, once seen as an asset, was beginning to feel like a liability, and in a system that prioritizes stability above all else, that shift in perception is significant. It signals not just dissatisfaction, but the possibility of action. And yet, even as that pressure grew, the outside world remained largely unaware. The palace maintained its composure, its routines, its carefully constructed image of continuity. But beneath that surface, the conversation was changing. The question was no longer whether something needed to be done, but how and when. And when the answer finally came, it came. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, as if the institution itself had decided that the less said, the better. The role was taken, the presence removed, and a new chapter began without acknowledgement. What made the shift even more striking was not just who left but who stepped in. Prince Edward was never the loudest voice in the room, but that may have been exactly why he was chosen. For decades, he operated in the background, building a reputation not through spectacle, but through consistency. Now, that quiet reliability was being called upon in a moment of institutional tension. While others commanded headlines, he built something far less visible but far more enduring: trust. The kind of trust that doesn't come from grand gestures, but from years of showing up, fulfilling duty, and never allowing personal ambition to overshadow responsibility. Reports suggest that within the inner circles of the monarchy, this consistency had not gone unnoticed. In fact, it had been quietly catalogued, measured over time, and ultimately preserved as a kind of safeguard, something to rely on when circumstances demanded calm over charisma. And those circumstances, it seems, had finally arrived. There is something almost paradoxical about Edward's position in the royal structure. For years, his contributions were described as steady but unremarkable, important yet rarely celebrated. He wasn't the center of attention, nor did he attempt to be. Instead, he moved through the institution with a kind of disciplined restraint, aligning himself with its traditions, respecting its boundaries, and above all, protecting its image through quiet service. Insiders whisper that this restraint became his greatest strength. Where others might have pushed against limitations, Edward worked within them, understanding that the monarchy's power lies not in disruption, but in continuity. And in a system where even the smallest deviation can create ripple effects, that understanding carries immense value. His loyalty, too, became a defining trait, not the performative kind, but the steady, unwavering commitment that reveals itself over time. Those familiar with royal operations suggest that Edward was often entrusted with responsibilities that required discretion above all else, tasks that demanded silence, precision, and an ability to navigate complexity without drawing attention. These were not the roles that generated headlines, but they were the ones that kept the institution functioning smoothly behind the scenes. And as the pressures within the monarchy began to build, those quiet contributions started to take on new significance. What was once overlooked was now being re-examined, not as background work, but as essential groundwork. The contrast between Edward and the figure he replaced could not have been more striking. Where one presence had become associated with unpredictability, Edward represented control. Where tension had once lingered, he brought steadiness. It wasn't just a difference in personality, it was a difference in approach, in philosophy, in understanding what the role demanded. And that difference mattered. Because at its core, the monarchy is not just about visibility, it is about balance. And balance requires figures who can absorb pressure without amplifying it. Edward, by all accounts, had spent years preparing for exactly that, even if he never expected to be called upon in such a direct way. As his responsibilities quietly expanded, so too did the confidence placed in him. Senior royal figures, once content to let him operate in the background, began to rely on his judgment more openly. His presence in key discussions increased. His role in shaping decisions became more apparent, even if it was never publicly acknowledged. It was a shift that spoke volumes without ever needing to be explained. Because within the monarchy, trust is not declared, it is demonstrated, and then quietly reinforced over time. And Edward, it seems, had reached a point where that trust could no longer remain in the shadows. But Edward's appointment wasn't just about stability, it was a response to something far more disruptive. Behind the polished facade of royal appearances, something had been unraveling. Reports, disagreements, and a pattern of decisions that insiders found increasingly difficult to defend. What once seemed manageable had quietly escalated into a problem the institution could no longer ignore. At first, it was easy to dismiss small inconsistencies, moments that didn't quite align with the expectations of such a tightly controlled system. But over time, those moments began to form a pattern. Insiders whisper that concerns had been raised more than once, not in dramatic confrontations, but in measured conversations that carried an undercurrent of urgency. There were questions about judgment, about boundaries, about whether the role was being executed with the level of discipline it demanded. And in a structure where even minor deviations can carry significant consequences, those questions began to weigh heavily. Reports suggest that relationships within the inner circle had started to strain. Not openly, not in a way that could be easily observed from the outside, but in subtle shifts: less collaboration, more distance. A growing reluctance to rely on decisions that once would have been accepted without hesitation. It was the kind of tension that doesn't explode, but lingers, quietly reshaping the dynamics of power and trust. And as those dynamics shifted, the role itself began to feel unstable, as though it no longer fit seamlessly within the system it was meant to serve. At the same time, the media began to take notice. Not all at once, and not with definitive claims, but through a series of carefully worded reports that hinted at something deeper. Observers pointed to inconsistencies, to unexplained changes in routine, to moments that suggested more was happening behind the scenes than the palace was willing to acknowledge. Each report added another layer of scrutiny, another reason for the institution to tighten its control. But control, in this case, meant containment. Efforts were made to minimize attention, to maintain the appearance of continuity, to ensure that whatever was unfolding remained internal. Statements were measured, appearances carefully managed, and any suggestion of conflict was quietly deflected. Yet containment has its limits, and as the pressure built, it became increasingly clear that the situation could not be managed indefinitely. Those familiar with the internal structure suggest that discussions began to shift in tone. What had once been framed as a challenge to navigate was now being seen as a risk to mitigate. The distinction may seem subtle, but within the monarchy, it marks a critical turning point, because when something is perceived as a risk, it demands action. The tipping point, when it came, was not marked by a single dramatic event, but by a convergence of factors that could no longer be ignored. Timing, in this context, became everything. The institution was already navigating broader pressures, balancing public expectations with internal stability. To allow uncertainty to persist within such a sensitive role was no longer an option. Insiders suggest that the decision, once made, was executed with precision. No delays, no public debate, just a quiet, decisive shift that signaled a clear change in direction. And when that tipping point arrived, the response was swift and unmistakably strategic. There was no dramatic announcement, no public confrontation, just a series of quiet adjustments that, when viewed together, told a very different story. Engagements reassigned, access quietly restricted, and one figure gradually stepping back as another stepped forward. It began with schedules, the most controlled and revealing instrument within the royal system. Dates that once carried one name were suddenly updated, sometimes at the last moment, sometimes without explanation at all. At first, these changes appeared routine, the kind of minor adjustments that happen within any institution managing complex commitments. But as the pattern repeated, it became harder to dismiss. Reports suggest that entire responsibilities were being reallocated, not publicly, but through internal channels where decisions are executed rather than announced. Then came the shift in appearances. The absence that had once been. Occasional became consistent. Events that would have once guaranteed a presence now unfolded without it, while Prince Edward's role within those same spaces began to expand. Insiders whisper that this was not coincidence, but coordination, a deliberate recalibration designed to avoid disruption while ensuring continuity. It was not about replacing one figure overnight, but about phasing influence out while reinforcing stability in parallel. And that process required precision. Every movement, every adjustment had to align with the broader objective of maintaining control without drawing attention. Internal communications, though never publicly disclosed, are said to have reflected this shift with increasing clarity. Instructions became more specific. Boundaries, once flexible, were now firmly defined. Those familiar with the system suggest that access, both physical and operational, was quietly restructured. Meetings were attended by different figures. Documents circulated through revised channels. The kind of procedural changes that rarely make headlines, yet fundamentally alter how authority is exercised. And through it all, there was no formal acknowledgement. No statement confirming what was happening, no direct explanation offered to the public. The silence was not accidental, it was strategic. Managing perception, in this context, became just as important as managing reality. The palace maintained its outward rhythm, ensuring that engagements continued, that appearances remained consistent, that the image of continuity was preserved. But beneath that surface, the structure was being adjusted with careful intent. Royal watchers, attuned to even the smallest deviations, began to notice. A name missing from a program, a presence that no longer appeared where it once had, a growing prominence of Edward in roles that had previously belonged elsewhere. These were not dramatic signals, but they were unmistakable to those who knew where to look. And yet, the most striking element of this transition was its restraint. There was no attempt to rewrite the narrative, no effort to publicly justify the changes. Instead, the institution allowed the shift to speak for itself, trusting that over time, the new reality would simply become accepted. It was a calculated approach, one that prioritized stability over transparency, control over explanation. Because within the monarchy, perception is not shaped through declarations, it is shaped through consistency. And consistency, once established, becomes its own form of authority. But while the transition appeared smooth on the surface, its implications ran much deeper. This wasn't just about one role changing hands, it was about control, influence, direction. With Prince Edward stepping in, the balance within the royal structure began to shift in ways that insiders had long anticipated but rarely discussed openly. Because within the monarchy, roles are never isolated, they are connected. Threads in a much larger system of authority, where even the quietest adjustment can trigger a ripple effect across the entire institution. And this particular shift carried weight. It signaled not just a replacement, but a recalibration of priorities, a subtle but unmistakable move toward reinforcing a more traditional framework. Reports suggest that Edward's presence began to stabilize areas that had previously felt uncertain. His approach, rooted in discipline and continuity, aligned closely with what many within the institution consider its core values. That alignment mattered. It reassured those who had grown uneasy, those who believed that the monarchy's strength lies in its ability to remain consistent even under pressure. And as Edward's influence quietly expanded, so too did the confidence of those who favored a return to a more controlled, measured approach. Insiders whisper that this was not simply welcomed, it was expected, a course correction that had been discussed in careful, guarded terms long before it became visible. At the same time, the redistribution of authority among senior figures began to take shape. Where there had once been ambiguity, there was now clarity. Responsibilities were more clearly defined, decision-making channels more structured. This was not about concentrating power in one place, but about restoring balance, ensuring that influence was exercised in a way that supported the institution rather than complicating it. And in that process, Edward's role became central, not because he sought prominence, but because his presence allowed others to operate with greater certainty. It created a framework in which the monarchy could function more predictably, more cohesively. Reactions within the institution, however, were not entirely uniform. Different factions, each with their own perspectives, interpreted the shift in their own way. Some saw it as a necessary step, a reinforcement of stability at a critical moment. Others, according to those familiar with internal sentiment, viewed it as a signal that the institution was becoming more cautious, more guarded in its approach. Yet even among differing views, there was a shared recognition that the change carried significance. It was not random. It was deliberate. And it was shaping the direction in which the monarchy would move next. Beyond the internal dynamics, the shift also began to influence how the monarchy presented itself to the outside world. Public messaging, while still carefully controlled, started to reflect a quieter, more consistent tone. Engagements emphasized continuity. Statements reinforced stability. The focus, subtly but clearly, was on preserving trust, on reminding the public that the institution remained steady, even as changes unfolded behind the scenes. It was a delicate balance, one that required precision, because any visible inconsistency could undermine the very stability the shift was meant to restore. And yet, for all its precision, the transition left questions lingering, not about what had happened that was becoming increasingly clear, but about what it meant for the future. Because when an institution as established as the monarchy makes a move of this nature, it is rarely confined to the present. It is a signal, a marker of intent, a glimpse into how it plans to navigate the challenges ahead. And as Edward settled into his role, the implications of that signal continued to unfold, shaping expectations in ways that had yet to fully reveal themselves. And as the dust began to settle, one question lingered above all others: what comes next? Once the pattern became impossible to ignore, the silence broke, headlines shifted, analysts weighed in, and the public, long accustomed to reading between the lines, began connecting the dots faster than the palace could respond. What had started as quiet speculation suddenly surged into full public conversation, not because of any official confirmation, but because the evidence had become too consistent to dismiss. Reports suggest that major outlets began revisiting earlier signals, piecing together timelines, highlighting the subtle but undeniable transition that had taken place. The absence, once questioned, was now being treated as fact, and in its place, the steady rise of Prince Edward became the focal point of analysis. Media coverage quickly split into two distinct narratives. On one side, there were those who framed the shift as a stabilizing move, a necessary adjustment designed to reinforce continuity within the monarchy. They pointed to Edward's long-standing reputation, his measured approach, and his alignment with traditional values as evidence that the institution was simply recalibrating itself in response to internal pressure. But on the other side, a more critical tone began to emerge. Commentators questioned the lack of transparency, the absence of a formal explanation, and the implications of such a significant change being carried out without public acknowledgement. For them, the story was not just about stability, it was about what had gone wrong in the first place. Insiders and royal experts added further complexity to the conversation. Some, speaking cautiously, suggested that the transition had been inevitable, the result of mounting concerns that could no longer be contained. Others hinted at deeper tensions, describing a system under strain where decisions were being made not just for the present, but for long-term preservation of the institution. These perspectives, though varied, shared a common thread: the recognition that this was no ordinary adjustment. It was a response to something significant, even if the full details remained obscured. Meanwhile, social media amplified every detail, every theory, every perceived inconsistency. The public, no longer reliant solely on official statements, began to dissect the situation in real time. Timelines were constructed, appearances analyzed, even the smallest changes were scrutinized, discussed, and debated. What the palace had attempted to manage quietly was now unfolding in a space where control was far more difficult to maintain. And yet, despite the intensity of the reaction, there was also a sense of familiarity. The audience had seen this before, not the specifics, but the pattern. A quiet shift, a delayed recognition, a sudden surge of attention once the pieces finally aligned. Through it all, the palace maintained its composure. Statements, when issued, were measured, carefully worded, offering no direct confirmation of the transition but reinforcing the message of continuity. Engagements continued. Appearances remained consistent. The strategy was clear. Acknowledge nothing, disrupt nothing, allow the narrative to settle on its own. It was a calculated response, one that prioritized stability over immediate clarity. Because within the monarchy, perception is not just managed, it is paced. And by controlling the tempo of information, the institution retains a degree of influence over how the story ultimately unfolds. Yet beneath the noise of public reaction, the real story remained rooted in something far more enduring. In the end, the transition may be remembered not as a sudden upheaval, but as a calculated reset. A moment where the institution quietly corrected its course, placing trust in a figure defined not by controversy, but by consistency. Because when the noise fades and the speculation settles, what remains is not the shock of change, but the intention behind it. Reports suggest that this was never meant to be a reactive move. It was strategic, measured, a response shaped not by urgency alone, but by a long-term vision of preservation. Within the monarchy, decisions of this magnitude are rarely about the present moment, they are about safeguarding what comes next. And in that context, the rise of Prince Edward begins to look less like a replacement and more like a repositioning of trust. For decades, Edward existed on the periphery of public attention, steady but understated. Now, that very steadiness has become central to the institution's direction. Insiders whisper that his role may continue to expand, not in dramatic leaps, but through a gradual consolidation of responsibility. The kind that reshapes influence over time rather than announcing itself all at once. And that possibility carries weight. Because if this transition represents a broader strategy, then Edward is not just a participant, he is a cornerstone of what comes next. A figure positioned to reinforce continuity at a time when uncertainty has tested the institution's resilience. What this signals about the monarchy's future is both subtle and profound. It suggests a shift toward caution, toward reinforcing the structures that have historically defined its strength. Not a rejection of change, but a careful management of it. A recognition that stability, especially in moments of tension, is not just desirable. It is essential. The lessons drawn from the controversy are clear, even if they are never publicly stated. Trust must be preserved. Roles must be executed with precision. And when that balance is disrupted, correction must come swiftly, even if quietly. Because the cost of inaction within such a system is far greater than the risk of change. There is also something deeper at play, a reflection on legacy itself. The monarchy does not measure its success in moments, but in continuity, in its ability to endure, to adapt without appearing to fracture. And every decision, every adjustment, feeds into that larger narrative. The quiet transition that unfolded, the careful management of perception, the deliberate reinforcement of stability, all of it speaks to an institution that understands the weight of its own history and the responsibility of carrying it forward. As the story moves beyond speculation and into acceptance, the emotional weight begins to shift. What once felt uncertain now appears intentional. What once seemed like disruption now reveals itself as design. And in that realization, there is a kind of resolution, not because every question has been answered, but because the direction has become clear. The monarchy, faced with internal strain, chose not to fracture, but to recalibrate. To place its trust in a figure whose strength lies not in commanding attention, but in maintaining order. Because in the House of Windsor, the most powerful moves are rarely the loudest, they are the ones made in silence, long before the world realizes what has changed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.